Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, John Miller. Mary asked me to introduce John. I thought to myself, where do I start? He has that kind of resume, so I'll try to net it out for you. He's been a close friend to Voices for many years now. In fact, we recognized John at one of our galas for his leadership since 9/11. He's part of Linked and literally respected worldwide. John is now recently retired from his role with NYPD as a Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism. His role was to keep us safe following 9/11 from terrorism, and he did just that. I think of that assignment, and it does seem like Mission Impossible when you think of all the threats and so forth, and John should be commended for that. Many of us remember John from his correspondent days, local news in the New York stations and nationally at ABC News. And I still get chills personally thinking about the story, John, you told at our gala of in 1998 of interviewing Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And I think if I remember right, it was in a cave in Afghanistan. And it's just an amazing prelude to what happened. John has had key roles with the FBI, LAPD, and others. So suffice it to say that he's been at the forefront of establishing platforms that have been adopted nationally in risk assessment of potential terrorist targets. He combined intelligence and analysis for LAPD, LA sheriffs, and FBI that's being used nationally. We are safer thanks to John. John's topic today is building trust in turbulent times. Join me in welcoming John Miller.
So, thank you for the kind introduction, Frank. And it's so good to see all our old friends together again, brought together by the Linked Alumni Association. I am now the Chief Law Enforcement and Intelligence Analyst for CNN. So started that job yesterday. It's funny because, I was walking down the street and ran into somebody, and they've been telling people, I saw John Miller. He looks completely different. Like that dark cloud is lifted, that 1,000-mile gaze. It's, well, sure. I used to go to bed in the NYPD every night thinking, what is it that we think that I don't know? What is that thing that we don't know? Now I'm with the press. We know everything. Sleep like a baby, doesn't really matter. I'm here today in large part because of the passing of the Queen. It has taken over the airwaves, as it should. And whatever story could pop up today is not going to be overcome by that. But, for the first 2 days, I was on like 10 different times. It was all Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump, secret documents. And I don't know why they pick on the guy. I mean, A, he's doing what we would all do. He's out of work and he's been reading the classifieds in the basement. I mean, it's kind of an alibi. But being together again and being here, look, there's a lot of hotels in Manhattan. We're here for a reason. We are literally in the shadow of the gleaming tower that stands where there were ashes and a deep hole, not just in the ground, but in so many people's lives. And, you drive by here today. I have an entire scenario that plays through my head every time I go past this spot, which is all the time. And yet, you see this building, thousands of people coming to work. More people go to work in that place than lived in the town I grew up in. And that is about resilience. It's about rebuilding. It's about replacing that structure. But in terms of the loss, the human loss, that is not something that you can rebuild with that kind of structure. You know, Mary and Frank Fetchit, they can't get their son back. That's not something that can be rebuilt. But they built something else. They built a group with a purpose of people who have faced unspeakable loss and are bonded together in common purpose and determination. It's hard to understand loss on the scale of 9/11. It's not scalable the way we consider human loss. It tipped every scale that we had ever used before. But in the personal sense, nobody lost 3,000 people. Most people lost one. Some people lost two: a son, a daughter, a brother, a father, a mother, a sister. And for them, that was the greatest loss. There were two kinds of victims on that day. There were the people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, who were dealt a terrible card by destiny. There was nothing they could do. And then there were those who understood exactly what the danger was and went running towards it, understanding exactly what the cost could and likely would be. And they did that anyway. And that was hundreds of first responders and thousands who are still paying all these years later through sickness and disease. Both are victims of the same thing. Both are bonded together through LINCT, through law enforcement, through Invictum, through the Voices Group. And in another way, that building, the building of human relationships and a common purpose, is the more remarkable structure than the one that stands next door. Think of the buildings of people that happened after that. You know, Frank talked about the efforts that Mary and others went to that led to a 9/11 commission, but it also led to the formulation of extraordinarily valuable partnerships across the country. You know, I was in the FBI with Director Mueller when they were building out 103 joint terrorism task forces in every major city and town in the United States, based on trust, information sharing, collaboration. In New York City, Commissioner Ray Kelly and Deputy Commissioner David Cohen built a counterterrorism and intelligence apparatus second to none in municipal policing, probably anywhere in the world. And that served to create many victims who were not victims by preventing many plots. You know, I look at Chief Tom Galati right here front and center, Rebecca Weiner. Tom's the chief of intel at NYPD. Rebecca runs the team of analysts as the assistant commissioner. And you think of the work that they do every day. See, Tom still sleeps the way I used to not sleep, which is not sleep. But the work they do every day with the detectives, you know, who build these cases and prevent these plots in an intelligence-based way before they happen. The analysts who are putting together those little strings and threads and crumbs and dots and saying, here's what we think this means. Maybe we need to point in a different direction, look in a different place. The undercovers, you know, who we don't even talk about by name. You know, we just refer to them by their numbers, who put themselves in the middle of these places and people in groups when these plots are unfolding. And, you know, I always wondered what it would be like if you could meet those victims, the victims that weren't affected by the plot, that didn't happen. Like, what if we could have a conference? What if we could have them here? What if all the victims that weren't hurt or killed from those plots could come here? We wouldn't have enough room, not in this space. And that's a good thing. Think of the plots. I mean, nobody can rattle them off like Rebecca. She has a computer-like brain, although Tom Galati is the Rain Man of terrorism. You know, an active shooter plot targeting the red steps in Times Square. I can't go by the red steps and look at the people sitting there without thinking, they're sitting there this week on this day, and they have no idea what went into making that not happen. It took a year and a half of work to get in front of that and stop the people behind it. A plot to use a truck bomb on Wall Street. That guy stood in a hotel room not far from this hotel, pressing that button over and over again, and couldn't figure out why the bomb wouldn't detonate. And that was because of an undercover operation with NYPD detectives and FBI agents who got in front of that plot and had the controlling features to make sure there was nothing in that van downstairs but a lot of wires and sawdust. There were plots to attack the subway system. I think of Najibullah Zazi and that crew who went to Afghanistan and met with bin Laden. Not that that makes everyone who ever did that a bad person. And came back, seeking to create mass carnage. That didn't happen. So if you think of what it would be like to meet all of those people, wouldn't it be great to get them in the room with those detectives, even those undercovers? They could be on a first number basis and talk about that. But we don't. We can't because, the plots didn't happen. We don't know who the victims would have been. We can't find those people. We don't know their names. They're the opposite of ghosts. They're people who are alive and walking around because of the work and the trust and the collaboration that was built out of the ashes from next door. Another such structure, which came out of all of that, it was all about building, but again, it wasn't a building. It was linked. Think about linked. I was driving on the 10 freeway in Los Angeles. In LA, we called it driving. I was sitting in traffic on the 10 freeway in Los Angeles, hurtling along at 3 miles an hour, when Mike Ferencz called. He didn't have a name, but he had a vision that it would be a group bringing together the Five Eyes partners and then growing out to bring together others that would be the leaders in counterterrorism across the world, ignorant of international borders, sharing information, sharing lessons learned, sharing the ability to not have an issue come up right away and call the State Department and ask for them to call the FBI and ask for them to call somebody, but where we could pick up the phone, John, and call each other and say, what do you know about this? What do you think about this? What are we doing about this? Do you need anything on this? Can you get me something on this? And the building of that network and the Linked Alumni Association, which takes the networks beyond, a lot of the people in the Linked Alumni Association, and I just became one of them, aren't working in the game anymore, but they have stayed in the game because nobody cares more than the people who have met the colleagues in this group. From the government standpoint, the JTTFs, the 9/11 Commission, what came out of that, even Linked, which, the best thing about Linked is it only has the slightest bit at this point to do with the government. It's all about people. It's all about networks. It's all about trust. It's all about connections. It's all about collaboration. But that was the government's obligation to make right, not that you could, but as close as you could to making sure that there would not be a 9/11. What's really more astounding is, the work of Mary and Frank Fetchit, of Sue O'Sullivan, because they had no such obligation. They didn't work for the government. The taxpayers demanded nothing of them. No commission said, well, the victims' families should have done more for each other. No, that was all them. In the dictionary, if you look up the word determined, there's an actual woodcut of Mary Fetchit's head right there. To find Sue, you have to go further in the dictionary. It's next to relentless. But you know what? Determination and relentless, when you're trying to get stuff done, that's a pretty good combination. And what they've built is not just what they sought to build, which was a victims advocacy apparatus of victims, for victims after 9/11, but an international collective, in Invictum. Who are we talking to today? 15 states, that's great. I'm sorry, 28 states, but 15 countries. And that is, again, about resilience, but about collaboration and about building trust. These are advocacy networks that started with nothing but determination and relentlessness towards goodwill for others so that they would not suffer in the aftermath the same way that victims had to find their way to help, to answers to people who understood. The really terrific part that comes together here again today, Mary talked about her first trip to LINCT, is that these groups, victim-centric groups, and the law enforcement groups, the LINCT team, and the Alumni Association found each other because they belong together. They should be inexorably together. The goal of the growing international collective is to ensure that the victims of mass violence have people caring for them and their survivors, but that it's not an afterthought. Oh, the terrible thing happened. A few months later, what can we do for these people? What can we do with these people? No, it's built into the machinery. That's not done yet. That's a work in progress. But LINCT and Invictum and Voices being together is helping to build out that network, not just here in the United States, but across the world. Even professional first responders, hardened but compassionate, even those with the training who know how to do trauma-informed interviews, when they talk to people, and I saw this happen. I saw this happen outside here, the West Side Highway attack. The man who ran down all those people in a pickup truck for ISIS. Most of the victims were from Brazil, and family members came from far away. And the conversation with a cop or an FBI agent, usually starts with, well, what did you see? What did you know? Were you a witness? What can you tell us? The better conversation starts today after training with, must be terrible what you've been through. Tell me for a minute about how you feel. Tell me for a little bit, about your son, about your daughter, about your relative. We'll get to what I need to know from you later, but tell me what you want to tell me. That's better, not perfect. But when you have the victim advocacy groups and support groups, Sue's been in this business since, am I allowed to say? 1981. Somewhere in the attic, she has a picture that's getting older, but that's a long time. That's a lot of understanding. But Mary and Frank, when they have these conversations, they don't begin with the standard, I can't imagine what you're going through or what that feels like. Because they, and so many on their team, actually can imagine because they've been there. It's not an abstract concept dealing with that kind of loss from random, inexplicable violence that hits at home. And that's why I think when you look at the things that unfolded after, LINCT was focused on Al-Qaeda and ISIS and terrorism. Mary's group was focused on 9/11 and victims and justice and proper care and medical care, psychological care. But what did the world serve up? We did pretty good with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but you have a Newtown, Connecticut school massacre, first graders and kindergartners. And Mary and Frank don't look up and say, hey, that's the next town. Like, we live here, but it's not 9/11 related, or it's not terrorism. They're not a bureaucracy. They are full on in the humanist end of this equation. And they went there, and they started that conversation. Yes, I can imagine what you're going through. And I think we can bring you to people who can not fix this, but they can help you through it. So you come out on the other side with something. And that has been repeated again and again. Turn on CNN. there's a massacre in a supermarket in Buffalo by a lone gunman, a teenager, a white supremacist, who has his own agenda that he copied from a guy in New Zealand who did a different massacre in a couple of mosques. There is this obsession with random violence and mass violence, and it's the anathema to people like Tom Galati, because you give us a plot with a network and a group, you give us a conspiracy with 3 or 4 people, we'll get into that, we'll stop it. Done it over and over again. But in the world we're living in now, where the conspiracy lives in the brain of one person, and they're dropping hints, but they're not telling anybody, this has become an extraordinary challenge that we see from Buffalo on a Saturday till, a couple of days later in Tulsa in a different supermarket, to a couple of weeks later in a school in a place that nobody ever heard of called Uvalde, Texas, that is now a household name for all the wrong reasons. So we can't call it the new normal, because it's not new anymore, and it's not normal. But it is part of the reason that what Mary and Sue and the collective of groups that they are bringing together, and what Linked and John and all of our other partners from the Five Eyes countries and beyond are struggling with, because it's not just happening here, it's happening everywhere. So, to sum this up, the network of victims, advocates, and supporters of service agencies, of law enforcement groups, and core among them, a lot of non-governmental organizations, are the key to this resilience, are the key to our going forward. And, as the theme of this conference picks up on, when we were in London, the theme of the last Linked conference was better together. We get it, we're better together. But these two efforts belong together. They have morphed together. We have found each other. And somewhere in some other hotel room, there's a meeting just like this with a couple of screens and a projector. People are talking about how to increase sales, or how to find themselves through some guru, or how to make money on the stock market. And they're very focused on that in the hotel next door and around the corner. But I know this because I almost know all of you individually, personally. There is no other room where they're meeting about anything more important, or where they care more about what they're doing and what they're talking about, which is why you all keep coming back. It's why long after you stop working in this business, you still come here and you still bring this together. So let's go forward and do this together, because that's where we're better.
So thank you, John. And on behalf of all of us at Voices, Linked alumni, and Victim, we want to congratulate you on your exemplary policing career at the LAPD and NYPD and others. And the thing about John is, despite the seriousness of his work, he has never lost his sense of humor, which was demonstrated today, and I forewarned him about that. We want to present you, John. Frank and I were in Kennebunkport this summer, and we wandered upon this gallery of this artist, Robert Payne, that died a couple of years ago. And he was personal friends with the Bush family and has created a lot of artwork that are in their, not just in their home in Kennebunkport, but other places. And this is entitled God Bless America. And he, I noticed the painting and mentioned something to his wife that's, continued to carry on his work in a sense. And she mentioned that he had painted it after 9/11 and presented it to President George Bush. And so I thought it was such a wonderful, painting to present to John. And on the back, you'll notice a letter that was sent by Laura Bush thanking him for the wonderful painting and mentioning that it would be hanging or put into the Bush Library. So I thought, from the mountains to the prairies to the oceans, I thought we are, linked is beyond the United States. And when they mention 5 countries, it's the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. But beyond, when you attend their conferences, they have people from all over the world. So John, thank you so much. And I feel very honored that he made the announcement about where he's going next. So a little plug for CNN. So thank you.
Let me get a picture here with you. That's great.
Okay, great. Thanks,
Thank you
John.
for this.
John brought up several important things. One thing is, and probably the reverse of what he was saying, is that we were thrust, victims' families are thrust into this arena. And, I think for most victims, they don't want another family member to have the experience of a horrendous loss as they have. But I think the thing that I've been impressed with as we've gotten involved with Linked and other individuals like Sue O'Sullivan, these people get up every morning and that's what they're thinking about, their job and how they're going to keep our community safe. For me, I feel that that is just an incredible, remarkable contribution that they're making, and they're choosing to do it. So thank you. I think we talked about a lot of the people in the room that have over 30 years of experience in policing or working in some of these federal agencies, and yet they're continuing on. So that's been really amazing for me. The other thing is it goes beyond the victims' families. And what I've seen at the Link conferences, we were very much focused on the victim-centered approach. But although the medical and mental health issues that we're experiencing here because of the attack here in New York City, that's an anomaly in a sense, but the reality is we do have to think about how are we caring for the police and the individuals that are doing that work, because there seems to be no end of it. And I think that's the transition that I've seen now, a real interest and recognition that, the victims that lost somebody and the survivors that were injured is certainly the immediate response, but what are we doing beyond that to make sure that all the survivors, from the janitor that cleaned up the school to the bus driver to the person on the train, we have to think much more broadly and be proactive in providing the support that they need. So it's my privilege to introduce our next guest, who does a lot of this work that I'm talking about, and Vincent Tolucci. Vincent, why don't you come up? Vince is the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer at the International Association of Chiefs of Police. The IACP is the world's largest and most influential professional association of police leaders, with more than 32,000 members in over 170 countries. The IACP is recognized as a leader in global policing, committed to advancing safer communities through thoughtful, progressive police leadership. Vince is responsible for ensuring that the IACP builds upon over a century of success. They were established in 1893, addressing issues at the forefront of law enforcement, such as advocacy, training, which is so critical, education, and outreach. Our connection with IACP is critical as we embrace a victim-centered approach and promote the importance of supporting the well-being of law enforcement officers who are keeping our communities safe. So join me in welcoming Vince Tolucci.
Good morning. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Voices. Thank you, Linked Alumni Association, and thank you, Invictum. It's truly an honor to be here with you today. Commissioner Miller, it's always a pleasure to hear you speak, and I want to thank you for your service and sacrifice and outstanding contributions in policing. The policing profession and communities globally have benefited greatly from your wisdom, experience, and expertise. Thank you, sir. Privileged to be here today on behalf of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, otherwise known as the IACP. The IACP is the world's largest association of police leaders, as Mary referenced, with more than 32,000 members in 170 countries around the globe. The IACP's mission is simply to help shape the policing profession. Since 1893, the IACP has been preparing current and emerging police leaders and the agencies and communities they serve to address the most pressing issues, threats, and challenges of the day by learning and evolving from learned lessons. Indelible, the word I use to best describe September 11th, 2001. My snapshot in time, I was a young research staffer at the United States Department of Justice, attending a law enforcement conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey. I was seated in the audience next to Chief Edward Davis, then Chief of the Lowell, Massachusetts Police Department, and future Commissioner of the Boston Police Department, who was getting preliminary reports about activity from Logan Airport. Seated next to Chief Davis was then Chief Edward Flynn of the Arlington, Virginia Police Department, home of the Pentagon. Chief Flynn learned that the Pentagon had been attacked from the speaker at the podium. The speaker at the podium? It was then New Jersey State Police Colonel Carson Dunbar, a retired FBI agent who had been deeply involved in the investigation of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. And the overall host of the event, then New Jersey Attorney General John Farmer, whose office convened that very conference. General Farmer went on to play a critical role with the 9/11 Commission. A snapshot in time, but it showed and continues to show the interconnectivity of 9/11. Everyone was touched, just in different ways, some far profoundly more than others. Indelible. I remember the suddenness of change that day, amid the pain, anger, and anguish. The images of heroes working to save others still stands out. I will never forget the bravery and the sacrifice of the first responders. Still front of mind for me to this day, 21 years later, are those we lost that day and the days since, and their families, friends, and loved ones. Please know, at IACP, these indelible memories fuel our efforts to get better today and every day. And it goes well beyond words. As a proud member of our nation's Homeland Security Advisory Council, meetings like this and conversations with you move quickly to policy and operational changes. The events of 9/11 changed our priorities and gave birth to new constructs and called for different thinking. We must think of our threat landscape in a different way and continue to work hard to identify information sharing gaps and identify systemic and structural shortcomings. As we all look to the future, we still find ourselves grappling with threats from the past that shape the present. While the threat landscape and plots have varied dramatically over the years in terms of complexity, sophistication, and ideological drivers, the goal of inflicting horrific casualties on communities has remained constant. Something we can never lose sight of and must remain vigilant on is the reality that the threat landscape has expanded beyond the primary fear of international terrorists plotting to take down democracy. Every jurisdiction must now actively consider, monitor, and prepare for the threat of domestic violent extremists. As Commissioner Miller referenced, we're now confronted by groups of individuals who believe they have been harmed or mistreated and who find like-minded peers on social media to promote racially and ethnically motivated violent responses. The attacks on cities like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Poway, California, Charleston, South Carolina, Christchurch, New Zealand, and Buffalo, New York are prime examples of how expansive the threat has become. Fringe groups have always been a concern, but these new threats are more dangerous, and the pace of plotting and attacking has increased, requiring greater vigilance from police and communities. Clearly, this changing threat emphasizes the central truth of the 9/11 Commission report. We must never become stagnant in our failure of imagination. For those leading now, and for those who will lead into the future, we, the IACP, will do whatever we can to help best understand the possible. Again, thank you for having me, and thanks for your individual and collective service and sacrifice. Thanks.